Policy Committee meeting. Oh, thank you. For May the 25th. Hard to believe that it's almost the end of May. And we're going to start the meeting with a roll call. Mr. Burdell Williams.
Present.
Mr. Zachary Epps.
Present.
And Miss Leah Mulhern, I know, should be joining us shortly, and Julie Haywood's here. Oh, good morning, Jenny. Hi, just did roll call, so I'll welcome you to the Policy Committee meeting and wanted to welcome Ms. Loman officially as a member of the Policy Committee meeting. She's been attending the Policy Committee meetings actually all year long, so thank you. Now she's an official member of the Policy Committee Policy Committee. Ms. Loman, I just did roll call.
I am here,
Okay.
thankfully. Thank you, Ms. Haywood.
You're welcome. Next, we'll move on to approval of the April 22nd minutes from the Policy Committee meeting. Do I have a motion to approve?
So moved.
Okay, Ms. Loman, is there a second?
Second, Charles Burdell Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Burdell Williams. And all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Say nay. Okay, the motion carries. Before we start the meeting with the old business, I just did want to take a few minutes, at least a minute, for a moment of silence for the students who were killed in Texas, and for the individuals who were killed in New York last week. This level of gun violence is, I shouldn't say unprecedented, but still really heartfelt, and just wanted to take just a minute of silence for those incidents. Okay, we'll start the meeting. Starting with old business, policy 620, designation of fund balance. Pass this over to Ms. Jackson and Mr. Diazio.
Policy 620, as you said, designation of fund balance, changing to fund balance is going to go up for adoption on June 14th, 2022 legislative board meeting. And from what I see, there haven't been any changes since our last meeting. And Ed Diazio, I'll let you take it from there.
Yes, that's correct. Good morning, everyone. No changes to this one since last month.
Okay, great. Do I have any board comments on policy 620? Okay. I don't see any community members present. So we'll go forward with policy 620 being presented to the board for adoption at the next legislative meeting. Next on the agenda is policy 622, financial reporting.
Policy 622 is also a name change from financial reporting to capital assets and GASB statement 34. Also, there haven't been any changes since the last meeting. And Mr. Diazio, you can add any other information.
Nothing has changed to this one. There was a question, I believe it was from Ms. Haywood last month, just about works of art, and did look into that a little bit, and they're rare in terms of reporting for school districts, but if there's sort of an understood value, or if there's a way to objectively know the value, whether it's from when it was purchased or if it's just otherwise readily agreed upon what the value is, that's the value you would use. If it was a significant asset and there was a dispute as to the value, it would be something that would likely need to be taken to like an appraiser to have looked at, and that's how that would be valued. So that I did look into that, Ms. Haywood, a little bit in between the meetings, and just wanted to circle back on that.
Great, thank you. Very much appreciated. Any board comments to policy 622? Okay. Seeing none, this policy as well will move forward for adoption at the next legislative meeting. Next on the agenda is policy in AR 610, purchases.
Okay, policy 610 will be changed to procurement. There's also no changes since the last meeting, and there's also AR with this one. Ed?
Yes, so in the AR, that's correct, Ms. Jackson, no changes to the policy. I did want to point out in the AR, we did go back and look at this section here on my screen, procedures for notification of bidding opportunities. And the committee will see that much of the language for minority-based enterprises has been retained. We did go back and take a look at the language. We actually broadened the language. So for example, before when it would say, develop a small brochure, we made that a little bit broader, for example, to say, distributing information, or so that we weren't necessarily tied into what the format was, but all of the language here about trying to make sure that school district bidding opportunities get distributed to a diverse cross-section of businesses, and then maintaining some sort of internal, I don't want to say a list, but maintaining some sort of, documentation of businesses that the district has done business with in the past that would qualify. That's all contemplated in here. And so I know that was something that we discussed at the last meeting. So that's the only real thing in 610 that I wanted to highlight for the committee.
Great, thank you, Mr. Diazio. With that change in the AR, which is definitely reflective of the conversation we had at the last policy committee meeting, is that language still embedded in the existing policy as well, or was that just brought over from, I can't remember what policy it was?
The only thing it looks that was in the policy was the definitions. You'll see here, guidelines for notification, and then it was a number of definitions. And then it just indicated here that the board directs the superintendent to have regulations. So there wasn't actually anything in the policy. So what I did was these definitions were let me just confirm here. You'll see here that those same definitions, women-based business, disadvantaged business enterprise, service disabled veteran-owned business, they're all defined here. So the definitions are, in this case, are in the policy with those regulations. We don't have them in both places, is what I am saying now, if that's okay with the committee.
Yeah, that's fine from my perspective, but I'll throw it out to the committee. Any questions or comments regarding policy in AR 610? Mr. Epps, I see your hand is raised.
Noting just in direct response to that last comment about the language in the AR versus Policy, for me, that's also consistent, and I appreciate Ms. Haywood for you raising the concern in the last meeting. And I would support the language in the AR as written as well.
Thank you, Mr. Epps. Any other board comments regarding policy in AR 610? Okay, seeing none, this policy in AR will go forward for adoption and posting at the next legislative meeting. Next on the agenda is policy in AR 258, gender expansive and transgender students.
Recording in progress.
Right. For policy 258 will go up for adoption to June 14th, 2022 board meeting. And I don't believe there were any changes at all in either the policy or the AR from our last meeting.
Okay. Any board comments regarding policy and AR 258?
The only thing I have to note here is that we are still waiting on some updated guidance from the U.S. Department of Education. I did put a follow-up message into them about 2.5 weeks ago, and they were surprisingly responsive to the status update and said, we're aware of the request, we're working on it, understand this is a complicated matter, and we have our team of researchers and experts looking at this and preparing something. We'll get back to you as soon as we can. So right now, this policy is, compliant with the law. It's protective of student rights. It does all of the things that I think the board and committee intended for this policy to do. When it was first adopted, we've revised it to sort of reflect some of the tweaks that have been made in the last couple of years, but this will be one that we'll continue to keep our eye on and bring it back to the committee, whenever there's an update, which, that could be, we could be looking at this again in 2 months if we get some updates. So we won't hesitate to bring this one back if something changes, because we know this is one that likely will continue to change as the, circumstances change and guidance changes.
Great. Thank you. Any board comment? I see Mr. Epps' hand is raised.
Thank you again. Appreciate the explanation of the policy and just because of and what it does, and just because of some communications that we've received and just conversations about the same topic at the state level and what protections should be available for students that are gender expansive. We did not hear Mr. Diazio or any from administration say that this is proposing changes to curriculum. We did not hear that this is going to require that teachers encourage students to question their identity. We did not hear any of those things. What we are hearing is how can schools be a place where students, no matter their identity, feel like they belong, which is really important for them to succeed and learn and grow. And so I wanted to say that for the right. I know I'm preaching to the choir for everyone on this call, on this side of the call, but certainly want to make that point for the record for any of our viewing audience and larger community.
Thank you very much, Mr. Epps. It's a very important point to make. Very important point to make. So thank you. Mr. Burdell Williams.
Just very briefly, +1 to Mr. Epps' comment for sure. From my perspective, I was not at the last policy committee meeting where this was discussed initially, but do to also agree with all of the detail that Mr. Epps just shared regarding our quest to become a more equitable school district and how this the language here helps us in that regard. Does not hurt us.
Thank you, Mr. Burdell Williams, for reinforcing that comment. I +2 Mr. Epps' comments. And just want to note for the record as well that it is really important, as the Department of Education guidance may change, that we are flexible to bring this back as soon as we can, if needed, to review, to make sure that we remain compliant with the law and continue to equally protect the rights of students. I do have a couple of substantive questions as it relates to the policy. One is, we use the word gender nonconforming, and I think under the delegation of responsibility, and I think we were going to change that to gender expansive.
Yes, that's correct, Ms. Haywood. And I'm actually seeing that now, and I don't know why that didn't happen.
No, that's
Almost
perfectly fine.
100% sure I made those changes. I'm wondering if I didn't save them. So I will change that. I apologize for that.
Oh, not a problem at all. And just as it relates to the privacy of educational records, I did not check, but I just wanted to make sure that we also cross-reference our student record policy, if we have not otherwise done that. And I think that might be in the AR.
And we can add that. Both of those changes I can add before second reading and adoption without this going back. I think they're both non-substantive from a legal standpoint.
Great, thank you.
All right.
Any other board comments regarding policy in AR 258? Okay, I see Ms. Loman.
I also just want to add for the record what everyone else has already spoken about, that I completely support the direction that we've taken with this policy. And I'm glad that we're, supporting a policy, and we will have a policy in place that is supportive of all of our students, however, and in whatever way they choose to identify. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Loman. And also, we were one of the very first school districts that adopted this policy, and I'm proud that we did that, and continue to stay on top of this policy in terms of making sure that it is responsive to the needs of our students. Moving on in the agenda to policy 711, naming of facilities.
Okay, policy 711 will also go up for adoption in on June 14th. The name will change, speaking of naming, the name will change to naming rights, from naming of facilities to naming rights. And Ed, you can proceed.
Yes, so there were no changes, I don't believe, to this one since last meeting either. This was up for review, given that it's been more than 10 years since the last review.
Okay, thank you for that background. Any board comments, Mr. Burdell Williams?
Maybe I'm mistaken and I'm reaching back into history, I think, but I thought we had discussed this policy. Did we discuss this one maybe a year or two ago and take it off of our schedule to prioritize others? I felt like we discussed naming rights at some other point in time. And I maybe it wasn't as a part of a policy discussion, but I just did want to just throw that out there, because seeing that the last revision date was 2008 didn't quite make sense to me, but maybe I'm mistaken and I'm thinking of something different. But
I
Ed,
think, Mr. Verdella Williams, what you may be remembering, tell me if this sounds familiar, the commercial advertising policy that gave third parties the ability to come into our schools and advertise. We had lengthy discussions about that.
that's what it was. That is what it was living in my brain. Yes. Okay, great. Thank you for the jump start to my neurons this morning. I appreciate it.
Just a few policies to keep straight.
Yeah, I mean, once you do it for a couple of years, right? There's shared language concepts across some of the different policies. Thank you for clarifying it.
Yep.
Thank you, Mr. Bordeaux Williams. Any other board comments regarding policy 711? Okay, seeing none, we will move this to adoption at the next legislative meeting. Okay, going forward to new business, starting with policy 362, 462, and 562, outside employment and outside business interest.
So this is the last of the 300, 400, 500 series policies. So once this one gets board approved, after the 2 readings, all of your HR policies will then be in one section, and we'll have completed that task of consolidating that we set out to do about a year or so ago. Very little update to this policy. It was a newer policy. It was just adopted in 2019. The one thing we did do is there were a number of forms that were listed on the website before, and I think some of them may have been draft forms and then final forms. So the good thing is there's one form and it's attached here to the administrative regulation. So really it's just cleaned up here. And essentially what this policy does is if employees are employed outside of the district, or they're engaging in activities on a non-paid basis out of the district, and those outside business interests impact students, there's a disclosure requirement, and there's some guidelines that apply to ensure that there's not undue influence. So for example, if a staff member runs a summer soccer camp, and they're also the soccer coach, this policy would come into effect to make sure that, a student who plays on the soccer team isn't pressured to also take lessons over the summer. I just made that scenario up, but there's no summer camp with the soccer team in Cheltenham. But those are the types of things that this policy was meant to address. And that, believe back in 2019, there was a lot of discussion about this policy. So again, nothing really has substantively changed. We're just cleaning it up and consolidating.
Thank you, Mr. Diazio, and thank you for that that example of what this policy was intended to address. I do remember us discussing that about a year ago. And I really applaud the administration and Mr. Diazio for consolidating the 300, 400, and 500 series policies. That was no small task. There were several of those. So I think we have fewer policies now, which is a good thing because of the consolidation. So I definitely want to, express my gratitude to the administration and Mr. Diazio for doing that. Any other board comments regarding the consolidation of these 3 policies? Ms. Loman?
Thank you, Mrs. Haywood. First of all, thank you for everyone who was involved in doing that work. That sounds like an incredible task. So thank you. I have just more of an operational question about this. How do employees kind of find out or know that they're supposed to be doing this, or new employees, sort of just how do people kind of realize that they need to kind of keep this on their radar if they're doing something outside of their school district employment?
Ms. Tolbert Jackson, would you fill that question, please?
Other than the policies, I am not sure if it is in the handbooks. So I'd have to follow up with Dr. Smith or the principals to see. But what I do plan to do, especially since we consolidated, is to send something out to let everyone know that now the HR policies are all in the 300 series. But I think Dr. Smith probably can add to that.
Yep, Dr. Smith. Thank you. I see your hand is raised.
Good morning. Just as a reminder, what typically happens at the beginning of each school year in August, Ms. Tolbert Jackson is one of the standing members who has an agenda item. And one of the things that she does at the beginning of each year as a part of her presentation is to highlight any updated policies that impact the staff and impact employees. So that could be shared. This could be shared as a part of that to prompt people to go to look for the policy. And then the other thing Ms. Jackson said is absolutely correct. I then meet with Mr. Diazio before the August meeting to talk about any updates to the handbooks or anything that has happened during policy meetings that he suggests or recommends goes into the handbook.
Ms. Loman, does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you. I was just, it does. That was helpful. I'm just, wondering how in all of these many policies, people are sort of alerted to this particular one that they need to kind of comply with. So thank you.
Yeah, not a small task either, given all of the policies that we go through in a year. So I appreciate also that work, Dr. Smith and Dr. Jackson and Mr. Diazio, to make sure that those are kind of consolidated in a meaningful and useful way for our staff going into the new school year. And I guess likewise, we do the same thing with the policies that impact students.
Correct. Okay. And I'll say, as a member of this meeting every month, it's also a good reminder for us as well, because we go through so many to remember, which ones have been updated and which ones impact the school level, which ones impact the central office level. So Ms. Jackson tends to consolidate those and present them to us. And we have access to those presentations at a later date as well for those of us who need a refresher.
Great, thank you.
One thing to add, Ms. Loman, I know, just so you know, we have not forgotten about the need to go back and look at the student handbook because there was some language in there, not even necessarily policy language, but just some like high level language that didn't reflect the current approach to discipline and things like that. If you remember, we were revising some of the policies that impacted the student handbook at the very beginning of this school year in August and September. And so we didn't make the cut for this handbook, but believe it or not, I still have an email from Dr. Smith from last summer in my inbox here to make sure that before the start of next school year, we go back and revisit that handbook. So that is something, as Dr. Smith mentioned, we will be doing that and have not lost sight of that.
Thank you, Mr. Diazio, for mentioning that. I appreciate that. I have similar emails in my work inbox. I will get to. So I appreciate that comment. But I do appreciate that because that high school handbook in particular was a real is a big one, and probably could also just be simplified as well, I imagine. So thank you.
Great, thank you. Any more comments regarding policy, the consolidation of those three policies? Okay, next on the agenda is policy 702, gifts, grants, and donations.
Yes, so this one actually goes nicely with policy 711 with the naming rights, because previously in 702, there was a lot of language in here about naming, which really was more appropriate for a separate policy anyway. I'm trying to find it here, but let's see. Yeah, there's language all in here about naming rights, which we now put in a different policy in 711. So this policy now, 702, is fairly narrow in the sense that it doesn't address naming rights. It addressed gifts, grants, and donations to the district. One of the things for the board to consider, this would be a new language, and happy to hear both board and admin feedback. This policy indicates that the superintendent can accept gifts up to $250 or less with notification to the board. Anything over $250 would get formally board approved, but any donation, regardless of the amount, would be acknowledged and a thank you note and things like that would be sent to the donor. We ran into this issue during and the reason why this item actually got put on the agenda for this year. You'll note that we just passed the 10-year mark for this policy, but this actually came up last year as an item that we needed to look at because during the pandemic, you may recall there were some gift cards that were coming in and the district was supporting families with in need during the pandemic. As those gift cards were being donated and things like that, there were questions about whether or not that could just be accepted and then student services could hand those things out to families in need, or whether they formally needed to be board approved. And so what we discussed long ago back then was the need to put something in place to say really any donation, whether it's a gift card or anything like that, should come before the board. But there was a recognition that if there was an organization that was donating items that were less than a certain amount, instead of waiting for a board meeting to distribute those things, they could be accepted on the district's behalf and acknowledged after the fact. So I looked at what some other school districts do in the area. Some don't put a threshold in their policy, but 250 was a number that I saw in some other policies. And so I propose it here, but the committee can certainly have discussion about that. Sorry for that long-winded introduction, Ms. Haywood.
No, it's very important to know the context for these changes and really helps, kind of focus our discussion during this meeting, which is important. So thank you. Any comments from the board regarding these changes to policy 702? Ms. Loman.
Actually, thank you for that explanation, Mr. Diazio, because I did notice the 250 value on there, and I actually thought, oh, that makes a lot of sense. So I support that language in there, because just operationally, allowing the administration to accept those smaller type donations and acknowledging them afterwards absolutely makes sense. So I support
that. Thank you, Ms. Loman. I agree +1 with that comment. The only question I have as it relates to the $250 value, I know because we got so many gift cards a year ago for the summer feeding program, would that be $250 in the aggregate or individually? Because I know that gift cards were provided by some organizations and some synagogues, and the value probably exceeded the $250 mark. But, so I just raised that as just a question, not to make this any more cumbersome, because in that instance, I quite frankly, if it was consolidated and the value was over $250, I don't know if I would have waited for board approval to accept those gift cards, given the emergent need for distributing those.
So what I would say is, if the donation was made at one time, and at the time the aggregate value of the donation was more than $250, I would say this would say have the board accept them. Now, I also believe that your superintendent could accept them with notification to the board and then have that ratified at the next meeting. But I think what this policy is saying is that basically at some point in time, anything over 250 should go on a board agenda. And I think with gift cards in the past, that was not the practice. That was not the operational practice. And the reason it actually came up was because at the end of the year, an entity that had donated a large number of gift cards had come back and asked the district for some sort of record that being accepted for maybe for purposes of doing their taxes or things like that. And there actually was no board approval because the practice was never to have those types of cards acknowledged. Now, the district was able to help that entity because we were able to just write a note or put something on letterhead that, you know, this amount was received from this entity, and that's all they needed for their record keeping purposes. But having this threshold to say that at some point, anything after 250 gets board approved, it also gives us a record of the approval so that if a donor needs quote proof, we can give them the minutes or we can show them an agenda, and that's helpful for potential donors as well.
That makes absolute sense. As it relates to, because I know, again, specifically as it relates to the gift cards, there was an immediate need. So should we consider changing that second or third sentence under delegation of responsibility, that gifts or donations valued at more than $250 shall require board approval or ratification in the event that there is an emergent need for dissemination of a gift? Something like that, I don't know, but
I can certainly, since we're still at first read, I could certainly go back and look at that and try to put some language in that would give a little bit of leeway to your point in a, you know, in the case of emergent need. I'll take a look and see the best way to word that. I'm happy to do that.
okay, because again, I do think it's important that the board is notified of those gifts and approves them. But in the event that there is an emergent need for the use of those gifts or funds, I don't want to hold up dissemination for a month until the board meets. Any other board comments to policy 702? Okay, Mr. Epps.
Yeah, this is more out of curiosity than anything. I think just because maybe of the time I've spent in government, when I first saw this, before I read it, I was thinking like the legislators, when they get gifts, not necessarily gifts to the district. And so again, I have full trust in the ethics and honor of our admin. So again, this question is for curiosity. To what extent do school districts even worry or have policies to that extent where it would be gifts to like board members or admin?
I believe, Mr. Epps, that's a good question. And either in the 800 series or in the district has a conflict of interest policy here, which talks about gifts. And you're probably familiar with the statement of financial interests, and this is the policy where that would be contemplated. Cross references the state ethics regulations, all of that, Public Official and Employees Ethics Act. So all of that's sort of embedded in 827 here.
Thank you.
Mr. Epps, would you suggest cross-referencing the conflict of interest policy in the policy 702?
I'd be open to that. Open to that suggestion.
Yeah, we can add a cross-reference.
Okay, great. Great question, Mr. Epps. Any other board questions or comments regarding policy 702? Okay, seeing none, this is again a first read, so those changes will be made and come back to the policy committee for further review. Next on the agenda is policy 801, public access to school records.
Yes, this is the policy that essentially outlines compliance with the right to know law. The procedures are pretty much governed by the law. You know, the timeline for an initial response, the records that are exempt from public access, what you have to do when you need to redact, all of that is sort of coming right from the right to know law. In the regulation here, the regulation is going to be much simpler here as proposed. And what's here is just the current fee schedule. If there's copying or postage, that's in an AR because these fees could change. We left the bulk of the procedural matters in the policy since they really just track the right to know law. Ms. Harding is the district's right to know officer. So responses to public requests generally come from her. And we've seen just not necessarily just in Cheltenham or even primarily in Cheltenham, but just generally right to know requests are at an all-time high. And there's a lot of requests that I don't want to say the requests are not in good faith, but there are times when right to know requests are filed to to find information or to go on a quest about, like, it's not uncommon, for example, to see right to know requests for every record that uses the word mask or mandate, every record that uses the word Black Lives Matter or George Floyd, every record that talks about cultural proficiency and equity. I mean, there are people and groups out there that are just looking for things for their own agendas. I can't say it any other way, right? So what's good here is that this policy just exactly tracks what the law requires us to do. For those very complicated requests that we get, Ms. Harding will usually work with someone in our office, usually Justin O'Donohue is her contact, to assist with those responses. Because there are times where sometimes there are tens of thousands of records that need to be gone through. And that's, unfortunately, I don't believe what the legislature ever intended with this law. But as you can imagine, it's hard to expect the legislature to make amendments to the law that would have the effect of limiting transparency. And so there are very, very few limits. And it's a very burdensome procedure on a school district when people try to use it for different purposes.
Thank you.
I'm going to make the font here.
Better share of right to know requests.
Yep. I'm going to make the font size a little bit bigger here. This one's coming up pretty small.
I appreciate that.
And then, but if there's any questions about the right to know law process in Cheltenham, happy to take those as well.
Okay. Any board comments regarding this policy 801? And we didn't really make any substantive changes,
No.
Just tracking the right to know law. Okay.
Yep.
Okay, Ms. Loman.
I'm just wondering, do we get requests where people don't necessarily, they're not asking for copies, but they want to come in and review the records? Do we get those kind of requests?
Not very commonly. Most commonly, people want copies, or they want, if the records exist in electronic form, and many times they do, we have to provide them to them in electronic form. There are times when we offer them to come in, but sometimes, Ms. Loman, the requesters are not even local to Cheltenham. And so they're not interested. Or what you'll see, we're dealing with another one right now where requests will go to every single district in the state or every district in the Tri-County region. And they've got 15 parts to the request, or sometimes more than 15. Sometimes there's 50 requests in a given request, and it goes to 500 school districts. So no, it's not sometimes you'll get a good faith request for a very limited scope of documents, and somebody will be willing to come in and pick it up or come look at it, but that's not what we see most frequently.
Yeah, that you're right. That has certainly changed because yeah, my experience with this law initially and the initial actually very restrictiveness of Pennsylvania's right to know law, and then the amendment to it, the expansiveness was really not for those large kind of phishing requests. It was to ensure that people who had good faith requests had access to those records in a timely manner. So it's unfortunate to hear all that from my point of view. But I'm fine with the policy. I think, it explains what the right to know law requires.
We're fortunate sometimes because when the requests do go statewide, PSBA will actually step in and provide guidance on a request because the exceptions are no different, whether you're a district in Northern PA or Southern PA or whatever, and they will provide assistance to school districts because you can imagine this can be a very expensive and time-consuming process for a school district. And there are some school districts, right, that are incredibly small, and to be hit with these major requests, can be a real problem. It's, we've gotten, I think, fortunate enough here in Cheltenham that we have good practices, and it doesn't, from a financial standpoint, has not become a tremendous burden, but that, we keep an eye on that. And there are some, I will tell you, there are some districts, some even more local than you might think, that spend hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars every year responding to requests. There's just, it exists. And so we haven't seen that. We haven't seen that here locally in Cheltenham. I think that Cheltenham is generally transparent with what information it puts out to the public anyway. So a lot of information is on the district's website. The district's active on social media. I think sometimes that helps because the more you put out there, the fewer requests you have. But we're just in a time where, as we know, public schools are targets for different things. And this law is one way to try to delve into what's going on in school districts. And so it's a policy we need to have.
Yep, thank you. So this policy will come back to the policy committee meeting for a second read, but will be presented as just a first read at the next legislative meeting.
Yes.
Okay. Next on the agenda is policy 256, student accidents and injuries.
This was one that I identified as potentially for repeal. You'll notice, and some of you may remember, in a recent meeting, the cross-referenced policy 815 on incident reports was repealed. We have nurses who are trained to respond to accidents, and the district has, in the context of sports and athletics, which is where a lot of student injuries would take place if you read the language in this policy, we have a third-party contractor, an athletic trainer who is involved, and there's a contract with that entity which outlines what their roles are. We also have relationships with the local emergency response organizations. So that when this policy, when you read it, it felt very there was a lot of procedure in here for a topic that just didn't feel like the procedure needed to be in effect. There's a lot of protocols. If a student's hurt or is injured at school, there are a number of people that are trained to respond under the circumstances, whether it's a small accident on the playground or an accident in the athletics. It didn't feel that it needed to be something that was hyper proceduralized the way that it was. And since we had just at a recent meeting taken care of 815, this was one that appeared we could also eliminate. But to
Okay.
be clear, there are still internal procedures for reporting student accidents. And that's why you have school nurses, you have an athletic trainer, all of those things. I don't know if anyone from the admin team has anything to add, but that was my initial sense when I reviewed this.
Okay, thank you. So basically, there are other procedures internally that really address reporting and addressing student injuries as they may occur on student property or at a
Correct.
school-sponsored event. Okay, any board comments regarding policy 256? Okay, I don't see any. So, oh, excuse me, Mr. Epps.
All right. I get the, thank you. I totally understand the rationale. And that's what I'm trying to resolve is that, is this okay? The procedures being in place sufficient within schools? We're applying that to student injuries. Is it because student injuries, that isn't a topic that necessarily needs to raise to this level, is why we're comfortable with trusting the procedures in place? Or is this just something that we would apply to maybe other scenarios? I can't think of one at the moment, but other scenarios where there's a sufficient level of procedures in place, therefore a policy isn't needed? Is that kind of at the premise?
I think what I think it's also hard to have, I think it's hard to come up with a very, very well-defined procedure for responding to accidents, since accidents and injuries can take so many different forms. So an accident that takes place in the context of athletics, well, usually there's, you know, the athletic trainer may be on site. For a student who's on a field trip who might have an accident, there's generally either a nurse that's on that trip or arrangements have been made for urgent care. If there's a student who's injured, you would call 911, right? A student that was in need of emergency treatment. A lot of that's just intuitive and staff respond just based on whatever the circumstances are. This policy was very, very, very detailed. And frankly, it wouldn't be the procedure you probably would want staff to follow in every case because it was too structured. And there's times when just staff and your professionals just have to respond to situations based on what makes sense in the moment. Does that help, Mr. Epps?
That totally makes sense. And it sounds like we're applying that premise of there's enough procedures in place to this situation only, which is what I was resolving.
And school nurses are under obligations to document all the treatment they provide to students. Like there's so many protocol that are just inherently in place that I think the board can be very comfortable that a student is never going to be injured on our school property. And a staff member looking and saying, I don't know what to do because there's no policy that tells me what to do when the student's injured.
Totally.
I say that, I say that in part to, you know, you as you smile, it's because it's intuitive, right? And our staff are trained, they're professionals, you know, they're in the business of helping kids. And so I think we can be comfortable that in an emergency, our people know what to do.
Yeah, and I'm confident in that. And I've been on the receiving end of very precautious calls. Something happened on the playground and we're just calling to let you know. And so I certainly appreciate that. And I have full trust in that process. My thing, and so what I was really, you've resolved it. We're not going to apply that there's enough procedures in place, so therefore a policy is not needed. That's not a blanket.
No, that's correct. I didn't. Yes, I did not. That's a very good point. I'm glad you picked up on that. So I would not be coming to you saying, well, there's a lot of procedures and law around special ed, so throw our policy out the window because, you know, it's governed by other things. No, it's not that. I just more meant there's more inherent structures that, you know, create policy through our contracts with athletic trainers, the training of our nurses, things that just happen in the normal course. Thank you for clarifying that, Mr. Epps. It's a good point.
And that special ed was a perfect example. So yeah, thank you.
Any other board comments regarding policy 256? I think one question I had, Mr. Diazio, as relates to Mr. Epps's last comment, would we have a blanket kind of statement that's similar to the one under the authority for treatment of student injuries, the very first paragraph? That would really be our student accidents and injuries policy, so that we have some affirmative statement that the board does require procedures to be in place to really, address any sustained injuries on us during the school day or during school-sponsored events. So nothing more than that, knowing that we have underlying procedures that are followed by nurses, principals, teachers, etc.
We could do that, and it could be a very simple policy that basically just says, to the extent that there are student injuries, that the building principal or the nurse are notified and appropriate action is taken to ensure the health and safety of the student. We could do that. It's up to you whether you want to have a policy for that or not. I have no preference one way or another. That's the preference of the committee.
Yeah, I mean, I think my only concern is, while we know we have procedures in place, and I don't want to memorialize every single detail of that, because again, it should be flexible and it's based on judgment many times. But I do think it's important from a fiduciary perspective to basically say that there should be procedures in place, which we know there are, but that there's an expectation of that. And so I was only really looking at that very first paragraph under authority to actually have as the policy.
Would the committee, we could do two things. We could keep a simple policy in 256. The other thing that just came to mind, we do have a district-wide safety policy that is newer, and certainly is newer since 256 came into the books. That, as some of you know that have been around for a couple of years, that district-wide safety policy addresses many things, everything from emergency evacuations of schools to procedures for inclement weather when there's an emergency closing, to cameras. Would injuries fit conceptually for the committee in that policy? And we could do that, or maintain a separate policy. It's just an idea.
Yeah, I actually, from just one board member, I like that idea as opposed to creating another policy. I think the subject matter would address this more general request.
I think it would also be good for the board to look at that safety policy. As Ms. Haywood, as you pointed out at the beginning of this meeting, like, we're continuing to see violence in schools, and another set of eyes at the end of this school year in advance of next school year on that safety policy may not be a bad thing. We also have a new facilities director, and so a lot of the safety items are facilities related, because it's the safety of the facility. So maybe if the committee's agreeable, we could list that for next month, the safety policy, and put that on the agenda.
Yeah, I would be in agreement to doing that. And I just am seeing head nods from the other committee members. So I think we're fine going forward.
Okay. And I'll build language then into the safety policy about student accidents.
Okay.
And injuries.
Everyone's okay with that approach?
Good,
Okay.
yes.
Great. Great, thank you, Mr. Diazio.
Yep.
Consolidation is much better than creating yet another policy. If we don't need that. So thanks for that suggestion. And last on our agenda is policy 609, investment of district funds.
Yes, this is another one. I'll fix the font on this. Mr. Linderman looked at this policy. This is very, very detailed. There are different classifications of investments that are permitted by school code. And then back in 2016, there was state legislation that was passed that gave school districts the ability to invest in some additional types of investments. And that's what you'll see here. We talk about Act 10 permissible investments. It was Act 10 of 2016. So this policy is outlines the investments that the district is permitted to invest in. It talks about all the nuanced requirements that have to be in the financial reports about how you present your investments. It's compliant with the current status of the law. The prior policy had last been updated in 2008 and didn't even contemplate Act 10 of 2016 at all. So that's, we looked at that because, again, it had reached the 10 years. While Mr. Linderman was still with the district, wanted to use his expertise to get this in place for whoever the ultimate director of business services is. And with this 609 being revised, the 600 series policies are generally in pretty good shape. And so as your new director of business services comes in, most of your 600 series policies have been looked at in the last couple of years.
That's great to know. Thank you. Any board comments to policy 609? I don't see any. So again, this will come back to the policy committee next month for a second review and will be presented as a first read at the next legislative meeting. Thank you, everyone. Any other comments before we adjourn?
Just one comment, Ms. Haywood, if I could, from me.
Sure.
I know that the last couple meetings, the agendas, some of the topics on the recent agendas have been a little bit dry. Incident reports and pest management and those types of things. That's because one of our categories of policies that we were looking at were just the old policies. After these are adopted and we get through next month's agenda, which will, with the exception of the safety policy, probably be similarly dry and boring. We are at a point where there are, with just a few one-off exceptions, all of our policies will have been reviewed within the last 10 years. And I think at that point, this committee can then really start to pick topics of interest and start digging into those policies. And I think next year, there can be a lot more meaningful and exciting policy work to be done because that whole backlog has been cleared. So I just say that because I know that there are some new members to this committee, and I'm very aware that these agendas have been a little bit, whatever you want to call it.
I appreciate that, but I also appreciate that we had to do some cleanup.
Yes.
And getting through policies, and we had many that were 10 plus years old, was really a monumental feat. And I think I really, again, thank administration and Mr. Diazio for bringing those forward, whatever the theme, whatever the topic. As a board, we still have to address them. But it would be great as we go forward to really look at, any policies that we currently don't have in place that we think would be useful to have in place as we go into the next school year. But we have to look at them all.
And similarly, if there are any topics in the existing policy manual that any of the committee members are just interested in, just send Ms. Jackson an email, because we will have room on next year's agendas to put things on the agenda. So feel free.
Great. Always looking for some more work.
Yep.
I guess one question, and this is probably for Dr. Scriven. I know that we deferred review of the sustainability policy in the policy committee until we had an opportunity to discuss that in facilities. And, with so many competing priorities between now, really in a couple of weeks before the end of the year, just was curious when we thought we would put that on the agenda for the facilities committee. And I see Mr. Burdell Williams is on the call as well. So you might have some insight on that as well.
I can just share from the facilities perspective, we had not circled back around to that topic as of recent history. Both Mr. Cohen and myself have discussed it, but we have not taken that to Mr. Holman or, advanced our conversations very much. But I know that we are at the brink of doing so for a variety of reasons. Namely, I think we pushed it trying to give ourselves a little bit of time, and that I think turned into a bit of, I think we took some attention off of that topic, but I'll let Dr. Scriven respond at this point, but we will be discussing it just amongst not just the facilities committee, but including our business partner, including Mr. Holman as well. But I would say that I don't expect it to be on I don't expect that conversation to happen in time to make it to the agenda for the next policy committee meeting. But I will.
I wasn't expecting that, but yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. I
Okay.
appreciate that.
Sure.
Okay, if there are no other board comments, we can move for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Zachary.
Okay, competing motions. I'll take Mr. Epps as the first and Ms. Loman as the second. All in favor of adjourning, please say aye.
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 All righty, the meeting is adjourned. I hope everyone has a good rest of their day.